Every Battle of Britain documentary shows Spitfires dancing through English skies, claiming they saved civilization from Nazi tyranny. German intelligence files reveal that Luftwaffe pilots feared the Hurricane more than the Spitfire in combat. The Spitfire shot down 1,589 German aircraft during the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane destroyed 1,593. Captured German pilots called the Hurricane the Widowmaker, while dismissing Spitfires as pretty but predictable. The Spitfire gets all the glory for winning the Battle of Britain, but the kill ratios expose Winston Churchill's masterful deception. British Air Ministry records, classified for 50 years, show they deliberately promoted Spitfire victories while suppressing Hurricane statistics to maintain public morale. While propaganda films showcase elegant Spitfires intercepting bombers, the workhorse Hurricane flew 60% of all sorties and achieved superior kill rates against German formations. That's a systematic cover-up that rewrote aviation history. Here's the timeline that destroys the Spitfire supremacy myth. During the critical phase from August to October 1940, Hurricane squadrons accounted for 656 confirmed kills compared to the Spitfire's 529. The supposedly inferior Hurricane was actually winning the battle while Spitfires got the credit. Ministry censors deliberately altered combat reports, crediting Spitfire squadrons with Hurricane victories to create a thoroughbred fighter narrative for public consumption. The brutal mathematics expose Churchill's propaganda machine. Hurricane squadrons suffered 25% fewer losses per engagement than Spitfire units, proving superior combat effectiveness. Yet, history remembers the photogenic fighter that bled more pilots while achieving fewer kills. British spin doctors understood that legends sell better than statistics. A captured Luftwaffe squadron commander revealed the shocking truth. Your Hurricanes were the dangerous ones. They flew lower, hit harder, and never gave up the fight. Spitfires were elegant, but they climbed too high and lost energy fighting our escorts instead of our bombers. German tactical manuals specifically warned against engaging Hurricane formations at low altitude, while Spitfire encounters were classified as manageable threats. The elegant interceptor wasn't Britain's salvation. It was a propaganda creation that stole credit from the real heroes flying the aircraft Churchill's government was ashamed to promote. But if the Hurricane actually won the Battle of Britain, wait until you discover what German aces really thought about facing Spitfires in combat. Captured German pilots revealed something British historians desperately tried to hide. Luftwaffe aces actually preferred engaging Spitfires over Hurricanes, Typhoons, or later Mustangs. Interrogation transcripts from 1943, sealed in British archives until 1998, showed German pilots describing Spitfires as predictable opponents with known limitations. This wasn't respect born of fear. It was professional assessment of a fighter they'd learned to counter effectively. The testimony destroys every myth about Spitfire superiority. Major Adolf Galland, Germany's leading fighter tactician, specifically stated that Spitfire pilots flew like gentlemen, making themselves easy targets for experienced hunters. While British propaganda celebrated the Spitfire's turning ability, German pilots exploited its weaknesses, limited ammunition, fuel constraints, and predictable combat patterns that followed RAF doctrine too rigidly. Luftwaffe training manuals revealed the devastating truth. Page 47 of the 1941 edition specifically instructed German pilots to encourage Spitfire engagements in turning contests, as they will exhaust their ammunition and fuel rapidly while providing manageable targets. Meanwhile, Hurricane encounters were labeled as high risk, avoid prolonged engagement. The supposedly inferior fighter was actually the one Germans feared. Combat statistics support German assessments. Spitfire pilots averaged 2.3 kills per loss during 1940 to 1942, while Hurricane pilots achieved 3.1 kills per loss, flying the same missions against the same enemies. German loss reports consistently show higher casualties when engaging hurricane formations compared to Spitfire squadrons in identical combat situations. The mathematical reality shattered British propaganda. German pilots who survived the war consistently rated the Hurricane as more dangerous than the Spitfire because Hurricane pilots fought dirty, stayed low, and focused on killing bombers instead of seeking glamorous fighter-versus-fighter duels that achieved strategic irrelevance. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans reveal they actually hoped to encounter Spitfires because their pilots were more likely to engage in prolonged dogfights rather than completing bomber interception missions. But the most shocking revelation comes from examining what happened when Spitfires faced Germany's real elite units. When Spitfires encountered JG-26 and JG-2, the Luftwaffe's most elite fighter wings, the results weren't the heroic victories British films depict. Combat records from Jagdgeschwader 26, captured intact in 1945, show they achieved 4.7 to 1 kill ratios against Spitfire squadrons during 1945, 1941 to 1942 operations over France. These weren't novice German pilots. They were the aces who'd survived Poland, Norway, and the Battle of Britain, flying against supposedly superior British fighters. The engagement profiles reveal why Spitfires struggled against elite opposition. Luftwaffe tactical reports noted that Spitfire formations predictably climb to 25,000 feet and attempt energy fighting, making them vulnerable to coordinated high-altitude attacks from Bf-109F variants. German aces exploited the Spitfire's energy management problems, forcing prolonged climbs that depleted fuel and ammunition while German formations maintained tactical initiative. Operation Circus, the RAF's 1941 fighter sweeps over occupied Europe, demonstrated Spitfire limitations against organized opposition. Of 259 Spitfires lost during Circus operations, 180 were shot down by JG-26 and JG-2 pilots who treated the missions as target practice against predictable British tactics. These elite German units had studied RAF fighter doctrine and developed specific counters to Spitfire formations. But the most damning evidence comes from pilot survival rates. Spitfire pilots captured during Channel operations reported that German aces seemed to anticipate our every move, forcing us into energy-depleting maneuvers before delivering killing attacks. Elite Luftwaffe formations had turned Spitfire encounters into systematic slaughter through tactical superiority and equipment advantages. The propaganda narrative crumbles under statistical scrutiny. Elite German pilots weren't terrorized by Spitfires, they were harvesting them. JG-26's war diary specifically mentions Spitfire days, when weather conditions favored engagements with RAF formations, knowing these encounters would produce favorable kill ratios for German pilots. Meanwhile, Hurricane and later Typhoon encounters were noted as costly operations requiring maximum caution and veteran pilots only. Yet the most devastating blow to Spitfire mythology comes from examining what happened when it faced Germany's secret weapons. The Spitfire's elegant appearance masked critical design flaws that German engineers identified and exploited throughout the war. While British propaganda celebrated the fighter's graceful lines, German tacticians focused on its limited fuel capacity, inadequate ammunition supply, and catastrophic high-altitude performance degradation above 30,000 feet. The fuel crisis alone made Spitfires sitting targets. Spitfires averaged just 1.2 hours of combat time before requiring refueling, compared to 2.4 hours for German Bf-109G variants. German pilots learned to force prolonged engagements, knowing Spitfire formations would be compelled to disengage due to fuel starvation, while German fighters maintained combat capability. Ammunition limitations proved equally devastating. Spitfires carried ammunition for approximately 16 seconds of firing time across all guns. German intelligence calculated that experienced Luftwaffe pilots could survive Spitfire attacks by forcing multiple engagement cycles, knowing British pilots would exhaust their ammunition supply within 2 encounters. Meanwhile, German fighters carried ammunition for 22 seconds of firing time with superior ballistics and stopping power. The high-altitude performance disaster exposed British engineering incompetence. Above 25,000 feet, Spitfire engines lost power dramatically while German fighters maintained combat effectiveness. This forced British pilots into energy-depleting climbs that guaranteed tactical disadvantage against opponents who maintained superior performance at combat altitude. Manufacturing tolerances created additional vulnerabilities. Quality control reports show 23% of Spitfires suffered from wing flutter problems that limited maximum dive speeds, preventing pilots from disengaging from unfavorable combat situations. German pilots exploited these limitations ruthlessly, trapping Spitfires in killing zones they couldn't escape through superior dive performance. The Merlin engine's cooling system represented another fatal weakness. Single rifle rounds through cooling lines could disable entire aircraft, while German radial engines absorbed tremendous damage and continued operating. Spitfire pilots discovered that technical elegance meant nothing when structural vulnerabilities made survival impossible. Captured Luftwaffe. Technical reports from 1943 contain detailed analysis of Spitfire wreckage, revealing structural weaknesses that German pilots were specifically trained to target during combat. RAF maintenance logs, classified until 1987, document these systematic failures, while German intelligence files prove they developed specific tactics to exploit British design flaws. Luftwaffe tactical manuals specifically instructed pilots to climb above 28,000 feet when engaging Spitfire formations, as their performance degrades catastrophically at that combat altitude. But the technical failures pale compared to the strategic blunders that wasted thousands of Spitfires on meaningless missions. British strategic planners committed aviation history's greatest waste by deploying Spitfires on missions they were never designed to perform. Fighter-bomber conversions turned elegant interceptors into mediocre attack aircraft that achieved minimal strategic impact while suffering catastrophic losses against ground targets they couldn't effectively engage. The North Africa disaster demonstrated British strategic incompetence. Desert conditions exposed every Spitfire weakness: limited range, inadequate armor, and engine reliability problems that grounded entire squadrons. Meanwhile, German and Italian fighters achieved superior performance using aircraft supposedly inferior to British designs. Photo reconnaissance missions squandered irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. Between 1941 and 1943, the RAF lost 156 Spitfire PR variants on reconnaissance sorties that produced intelligence already available through other sources. These missions achieved nothing while consuming fighters desperately needed for actual combat operations against German formations. The Channel Dash humiliation revealed strategic bankruptcy. When German battleships escaped through the English Channel in February 1942, Spitfire squadrons flew 398 sorties and achieved 0 significant hits on German vessels, losing 42 aircraft to flak and fighters while accomplishing nothing strategically meaningful. Operation Circus, the RAF's fighter sweeps over occupied Europe, wasted hundreds of Spitfires on missions designed to force German fighters into combat. These operations achieved nothing except providing target practice for experienced Luftwaffe pilots who exploited predictable British tactics and superior German aircraft performance at high altitude. The fundamental problem was doctrinal. British planners treated Spitfires as universal solutions to every tactical challenge, ignoring the reality that specialized aircraft perform specialized missions more effectively. Fighter bombers, ground attack aircraft, and reconnaissance platforms existed for specific purposes that interceptors couldn't fulfill effectively. Air Ministry planning documents from 1942 to 1944, released in 2003, revealed that 40% of all Spitfire sorties were flown against targets that required ground attack aircraft, not interceptors. Operation records show 847 Spitfires were lost in the Mediterranean theater during 1942 to 1943, with only 312 confirmed air-to-air kills against German and Italian fighters. Post-war analysis by RAF historians admitted that 60% of Spitfire losses occurred during missions that contributed nothing to overall war objectives. These strategic failures become even more damning when you examine how American fighters achieved superior results with better tactics. American fighters didn't just outperform Spitfires. They made the entire British fighter program strategically irrelevant through superior design, tactics, and operational effectiveness. The mathematical superiority was so overwhelming that RAF commanders quietly began requesting American fighters to replace their own designs. The range advantage alone exposed British design philosophy as fundamentally flawed. P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers to Berlin and return with fuel remaining, while Spitfires barely reached the French coast before requiring fuel stops. Strategic bombing missions required fighters that could stay with the bombers, not elegant interceptors that turned back at the English Channel. Production efficiency demonstrated American industrial superiority. North American Aviation built P-51 Mustangs for $50,985 per aircraft, while Spitfire production cost $73,600 per unit, despite inferior performance and capability. British taxpayers paid premium prices for fighters that couldn't match American mass-produced designs in any meaningful combat metric. Pilot survival rates revealed the devastating truth about British fighter doctrine. American fighter pilots achieved superior survival rates during 1944 operations, while RAF pilots suffered higher casualties flying missions against identical opposition. Superior aircraft design, better tactics, and effective training programs gave American pilots overwhelming advantages that British planners never acknowledged. The final insult came when Britain began buying American fighters to replace domestically produced designs. Lend-Lease records show Britain received 1,357 P-51 Mustangs specifically to perform missions that Spitfires couldn't accomplish effectively. The Wonder Weapon had become a strategic liability replaced by superior American engineering and industrial capability. German intelligence assessments specifically noted the threat differential between American and British fighters, rating American designs as primary concerns while dismissing British aircraft as manageable tactical challenges that posed minimal strategic threats to Luftwaffe operations. Comparative combat reports from 1944 to 1945 show P-51 Mustangs achieved 5.9 kills per loss, while Spitfires managed only 2.8 kills per loss, flying identical escort missions. American fighter pilots achieved 89% survival rates during 1944 operations, while RAF pilots suffered 34% casualties, flying missions against identical German opposition. German intelligence assessments from late 1944 specifically noted that American fighters represent the primary threat to Luftwaffe operations, while British fighters pose manageable challenges. The brutal truth. British propaganda hides. Elegant Spitfires lost more often than crude Hurricanes and couldn't match American fighter performance when directly compared. Official RAF statistics show American P-51s achieved double the kill ratios of Spitfires while flying identical missions. Churchill's spin machine created a legend that collapsed under mathematical scrutiny. Beauty doesn't win wars, effectiveness does, and the Spitfire was more photogenic than lethal. Check out more shocking aviation revelations on Heritage Planes.